Late one evening in Galilee, Jesus sat with his inner circle reading from the Torah. They just finished a passage in Exodus where Yahweh commands the Israelites to slaughter entire cities, men, women, children, livestock, everything. Leave nothing alive. Peter looked up, disturbed, and asked, "Master, why is the God of our fathers so violent, so jealous, so angry? You teach us about a Father of infinite love. But this," he gestured at the scroll, "this doesn't feel like love. This feels like rage." Jesus closed the scroll slowly. He looked at each of them. And he said something that would get him killed and that the church would spend 2,000 years trying to erase. That's not the Father. That's not the monad. The God you're reading about, the one who demands blood sacrifices, who drowns the world in floods, who commands genocide and calls it holy, he has a name. Yaldabaoth, the Demiurge, the chief archon. And he's been pretending to be the Most High since the beginning of this realm. There are specific passages, specific words he uses in your scriptures that reveal exactly what he is. Not God. An archon, a powerful one, the ruler of matter, but not the source. And when you know his true identity, when you see the evidence written in your own holy texts, everything changes. You stop worshiping the false god, and you remember the true one. That teaching never made it into the Bible. When the church compiled the canonical texts in the 4th century, they removed every reference to Jesus exposing Yahweh as the Demiurge. They burned the Gnostic Gospels that preserved his actual teaching. Because if Christians knew that the God of the Old Testament, the God they've been worshiping, praying to, fearing for millennia, was actually the chief archon, the false god of material prison, not the true Father Jesus served, the entire religious system would collapse instantly. No more guilt. No more fear of divine punishment. No more sacrificial salvation. Because that angry, jealous God demanding obedience was never God. He was the Demiurge, and Jesus came to expose him. Tonight, you're learning the exact evidence Jesus used. The passages, the words, the characteristics that prove the Old Testament God is not the monad. He's Yaldabaoth, the chief archon. And once you see it, you can never unsee it. If you're discovering the true identity of the Old Testament God tonight, comment, "I am monad, not demiurge," right now. Before I show you the specific evidence, you need to understand why this distinction matters. Because the God of the Old Testament and the monad are not two different interpretations of the same God. These are two completely different entities, operating at opposite frequencies, with opposite natures. The God of the Old Testament is jealous. He admits it. He demands exclusive worship and threatens punishment for acknowledging other gods. That's insecurity. That's an entity that fears competition because he knows he's not actually supreme. The monad doesn't have jealousy. Jealousy requires separation. But the monad is everything. There's nothing outside it to be jealous of. Infinite consciousness doesn't compete. It simply is. The God of the Old Testament is rageful, flooding the world, raining fire on cities, commanding genocide. The violence is constant and presented as righteous. But the monad operates beyond wrath, beyond punishment. It doesn't destroy what it created. It doesn't harm fragments of itself. Rage is reactionary. The monad doesn't react. It creates. The God of the Old Testament demands blood sacrifices. Constantly. Burnt offerings. The smell of burning flesh described as pleasing to him. He requires death to be appeased. The monad requires nothing. It doesn't feed on death or suffering or fear. Those are archon frequencies. The monad doesn't harvest. It emanates. And here's the critical distinction Jesus made. He never called God by the Old Testament names. Never said Yahweh. Never said Jehovah. He always said Father. Abba. He was deliberately separating the true God from the false God. When his disciples asked him to teach them to pray, he didn't say pray to Yahweh. He said, "Our Father who art in heaven." Different entity. Different frequency entirely. You felt this your whole life. Something was wrong with the Old Testament God. The cruelty didn't make sense. The violence, the obsession with blood and obedience, it didn't feel divine. It felt controlling, dark. And every time you questioned it, you were told not to. You were told God's ways are mysterious. Have faith. But that discomfort you felt? That wasn't doubt. That wasn't weak faith. That was your divine spark recognizing archon frequency. You were reading the words of the demiurge, not the monad. And your core knew the difference even when your mind didn't have the language for it.